Before we proceed forward with more Go blocks and anything more advanced and in-depth about block entities, we had to change the code for the previous Go blocks and utilizing our own library more. In this video, I will talk about those changes and I will talk about the reason behind those changes and we will see the result at the end. Hello everyone, this is Ali Reza. Welcome to the Mentor Code Lab. In previous episodes, we had added the towering, the chunk goos, and water generation and water eating goo. Now, we finished our job with water eating, water generating, lava eating, and lava generating goos. However, I was getting started to record about tunneling goo, and then I thought about a very critical thing. When it comes to tunneling, the direction of the block becomes important. Now, if we take a look at goo base, the goo base only has the powered property and we didn't add any horizontal facing to it. Of course, I could add horizontal facing. However, I thought to myself that, you know what, we can get rid of the horizontal facing and do something else. The reason is that normally you would add horizontal facing property to the block when you want to utilize that facing for the models and things like that. Of course, there is no rule against using horizontal facing as a logical property and not using it for the model. However, I had my library activated and being used in the mod, and because of that, I wanted to show you some use cases of this library at the same time. We teach the basics and intermediate concepts now and move forward. I was thinking about coding the tunneling. Then I thought to myself that, you know what, in the tunneling, we want to break blocks for the player. And at the same time, we have a big problem. Let me demonstrate it. Let's say that we are under the ground, so we are in a tunnel and we dig down a tunnel. Here is the tunnel and it goes up. Let's say that this happy dude is the player and the player wants to dig a tunnel in this direction. Now, if I'm going to break the blocks and replace them with something as we did with towering and we want to move forward, the problem is that we are not gonna do it block layer by block layer. I mean, it will not behave like the tunneling or chunk goo. What we are gonna do is that we will fill this whole tunnel immediately with air bomb goos, okay? And this will continue forward until we hit the limit. So we will fill this tunnel with the goo and we will do it in one tick. So if we want to break those blocks and replace them by air goo bomb, we will have a little bit of a problem with items getting stuck in between here and maybe jumping down, bouncing around. I don't know how they will behave because we are breaking them in place and then immediately replace it by another block and update the neighbors. So I'm not sure how it will behave. Now, here's a question. Let's demonstrate that tunnel again. And this time, I will use a red representation for the character, who cares. Now, what if we track the position of the player and when we want to break a block, we get the item and spawn the item on the position of the player. This way, we will be happily digging, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of blocks without losing a single block and, you know, the player is just staying there doing nothing and collecting blocks in one tick. Of course, it will rise another challenge. If we take a look at our configs, we see that the spread distance is 256 blocks. Now, if we multiply this by 9, we get the number of the blocks that we will drop at the feet of the player in one tick. Divided by 64, it becomes 36 stacks. Now, you remember we exactly have 36 stacks as player inventory. So eventually, the player will be filled with junk blocks and, you know, it's a challenge to empty himself, clean up the mess, and we are intentionally creating that mess for the player unless he is careful, especially when it comes to chunk, and we will talk about it in a few minutes. However, about the towering, he can't do anything unless he prepared beforehand. So and that's completely intentional. When I thought about this process, I thought to myself, okay, if I want to track the player's position, I have to put a property on the block entity. But wait, I can utilize the same system for the chunk goo, because right now the chunk goos are digging down and carrying stacks of item stacks actually of broken blocks on top of themselves all the way to the bedrock. And the player now needs to go down, collect everything and clean up the mess. Now again, that mess messy behavior can be what you desired, but in the chunk goo example, I will go into the world and show you that I had done some testing, and most of the time you will come face to face with 4 sets of double chests full of broken blocks. And this much messy behavior and so many items being in one place, in one chunk actually, will add to the lag. However, Minecraft has a game rule that sets the item stacks to merge when they are dropped on the floor and present less graphically busy content. That helps boosting FPS a little bit. So I decided that, you know what, I want that behavior of collecting everything in one place for the chunk goo. Now, think about it. We are gonna use it for tunneling. We are using it for chunk goo, and chances are that later down the road, I may want to use it on the bridge goo. And this means that I will have repetitive code over and over and over. Instead of adding the properties one at a time on the bridge, chunk goo, chunk bomb goo, and then I don't know, towering goo or tunneling goo, I made the decision that, you know what, I will add a goo-based block entity and I will handle these things there. And every one of the goos now will extend from the goo-based block entity. And of course, the goo-based block entity is now the tickable BE. Okay, so far so good. Now that I have this class, I could remove those helper methods that I added to the goo base and I move them here. So should not tick, and get distance. Actually, this is a much better place for them because they are related to block entities and not the block. That was the first step. Then I made the decision that, you know what, I want to carry the position of the player, but not for every single goo block. For example, the water generating doesn't need to know anything about the player's position or player's facing. The lava eating doesn't need that. The pumps won't need that, the air goo bomb or I don't know, stone bomb. So I made the decision that I can have a simple constructor and then I will have 2 methods, one being the overload of another one, and I will set 2 properties on the block entity. One is the player's position and one is player's facing. Now, how can I set them? Is that at goo base class, when we are using an item on the block, I'm gonna say that, hey, if we are instance of the block entity, the base class, please call set player position for the player. And I'm aware that I'm doing it for every type of goo. So yeah, water eating, water generating, water pump, we'll have them. However, I'm not activating any air goo or stone goo. So those 2 are exception, but water generating, water eating, and lava things are, yes, carrying this overhead. And I don't care about this little info there. At the end, we have 2 fields on our property, one carrying the player's position. Now, I could use player get block, and that would return the coordinates of the block that player is standing on it. However, if you know when you are standing in the middle of the block, let me demonstrate it. Let's say that we are looking at a block from top to bottom. So this is the block. If you are standing in the middle, the coordinate that player.getBlock will return is, for example, this corner. It depends on the facing of the player's direction. However, it will be one of the 4 corners eventually, and it's not the middle one. However, if you use player get pause, this is exactly the position that you are in the world with the precision of a double value. However, get pause will not return a block pause, but a vector tree of doubles. This caused me a little bit of headache because at some points I need to convert this vector tree into block pause. And as you see, I'm dropping that precision. I don't care because if I'm at a coordinate like this, let's say that it's 124.3 for the x, 27.1 for the y, minus 53.7 for the z. Now, I'm typecasting directly to integer, means that I'm dropping this precision. And I don't care because if you remove that precision, all you have is the integer section. And actually, this is the coordinate of the block, 124, 27, minus 53. So I can make a block position out of that. And then I use that for the get drop state, and I will talk about this. So that was one thing. And by the way, at some point, I had to convert that block position, as you see, to a vector tree D. Because, as I said, It's a little bit of a headache, but that's okay. So I have two fields. One is the position of the player. The other one is the horizontal facing of the player. So when I'm activating a goo block, I'm caching the direction that player is facing. Now, why is it important? In case of chunk goo or, I don't know, towering goo, it doesn't matter. But let's say that this is our tunneling goo block, and we are looking it from top to bottom. So this face is the top face, okay? Now, if I activate it, which direction should it go? This is the north, this is the south, west, and east. So which side should we go? Now, it depends on where the player is related to the block and what direction the player is facing. If the player is facing north, then we will expand the tunnel toward north. And of course, if we are looking toward east, then we will expand toward east, and so on and so forth. So we will cache that player facing. Of course, I have another overload for that, and here I'm directly sending in the vector tree and direction instead of the player. This will be used when we are putting blocks by code in the word, because when I'm putting a block by code, there is no player there. So I need to retrieve the original values from the same block entity that is doing the job and setting the target block's values, copying myself. You'll see what I mean in a few minutes. So then it came to my attention that in towering and chunk goos, both the chunk bomb and the chunk goo, we are doing the same thing. Basically, we are looking at a block, we are breaking that block, and we are replacing the same position with something else. So I made the decision that, you know what, I can dissect that code into its own method. So I say, hey, process the block. If the state is, actually it shouldn't be chunk bomb, we need to fix this one. If the state is something, then please break the block and then set the block state to be powered and to true with notify all, and then set the new position. Okay, now let's take a look at this and see how it's behaving. So inside the chunk goo bomb, I say process the block for the word on the new position with this block entity, okay? And then this is the state that I want to set in the word. So you see that here I say a word that set block state at the position with this state. However, here now I need to make sure that I have a value other than the state, because this is a goo bomb and it's another entity. So where am I using this entity is here that says break the block by this entity, okay? However, now I want to see that I need to use something else here. Let's go back to the chunk goo, and after the entity, I will say modblocks.chunkGooBomb. And yes, I don't have that method, but it says add this as fourth parameter. And when I'm doing it, refactor, it will jump to the goo base, hopefully, and it will add this chunk goo bomb. However, I didn't want it to be chunk goo bomb. Now, you may notice that it can be used here. So if I say it's chunk goo bomb, it will be okay. However, I want this to be another goo, and I can't use that. So instead of that, I will remove this. And yes, I have problem there, but I will come back down and intentionally, I will get this here and I will change it to be, for example, air goo bomb. Okay. Now, if we want, it says it requires block state. Now let's see what is air goo bomb. It's actually a block. Okay. So I will say that I want a block and I will call it block. And here I should be able to check if I'm the type of the block. So this should fix my problem here, and all of them are okay now. However, in this case, yes, I'm going with the chunk bomb goo. So I got rid of that hard-coded value. And you should be careful when you are extracting things and using IntelliSense to create methods for you. Something like this can happen because it's hard-coded values. But anyway, now I'm breaking the block at the word with this new position by this block entity. Then I'm saying that, you know what, at the same position, I want a new state with the power to be on. And finally, if at that position right now I have a block entity, please set the position for the block entity with this block entity and the original guilty block entity. So when we come back here, this is the set position. You see that we call the set player position, but instead of sending the player, now I'm using the original block entity and getting the values back from the block entity and sending them to the second overload so that the new block entity will set the player position properly on itself. Now, you may wonder why I use try and catch. This is is for the development environment. The moment I delete the testing word, I can get rid of this. Because when I'm testing the word, chances are that I will have block entities here and there that are still active and they don't carry some of these fields. And if I want to log into that game word, it will crash telling that, hey, I don't have this field. So putting it on the try will prevent the game from crashing at development environment. So I need to note that remove the try blocks when you are done developing the Goo blocks. So far, we understood the set player pause and set player pause overload. Then we take a look at this break block because this is the very first thing that we do whenever we want to process a block position. For breaking a block, I have an origin and facing being assigned. Then in each try and catch block, I want to try and read one of them from the entity. And finally, if I'm successful or not, I will have a final variable being assigned to the proper values. Then I will create a block position from the vector 3D. And finally, I say block.get dropped stacks. Now, in some videos, I used word.break_block. There are two differences here. Word.break_block has no overload for you to set the position of the dropped item stack, and you can't control that aspect. Also, you don't have the ability to use any sort of enchanted tool. However, block.getDroppedStack returns a list of item stacks. Now, this list of item stacks are the result of breaking that block in the game, meaning that if you don't use any overload that accepts an item stack as a tool, it will just drop the block like breaking a stone, I don't know. It will return cobblestone. I get an item stack of cobblestone as one block's result. However, I may get more than one item type. For example, when you are breaking the gravel, you can have flint as a byproduct. So that's the meaning of having a list. Also, take note that I'm using the block state and then the server world and then the coordinates that I want to drop the item stack and then the coordinates of the block with the entity. Now, if you look, there is another overload. So if I go to the implementation, you take note that dropped stack has one more overload, and this one more overload uses an item stack as an extra parameter. Now, if we take a look at that, you see that it adds a loot context parameter of a tool, and the tool is the stack. Basically, here I can say that, hey, I have a diamond pickaxe with fortune on it. Break the block using that pickaxe. Effectively, I'm using diamond pickaxe fortune 3, for example, on a block. And the list will adjust properly. We will take a look at this when we use miner machines, but right now, sufficient to say that instead of using word.break_block, we collect the item stack that would be the result of breaking the block. After that, we go into a loop for the list and we call each stack in the list, please spawn it in the world with this origin to drop the item stack and use this facing. I will talk about it later. And this is the stack that we want to drop and this is the deviation. Now, where did I take it from? If you look at item scatter.spawn, you see that we have some overloads that are calling each other, but at the end, eventually we get to this. This was my original code. However, notice that they are getting the math floor, then they are generating a random double, multiplying it by 1 minus the width of the item, adding half of the width to it, and basically they are scattering the item around the central position, maybe in 1.5 blocks, something like that. And I didn't want that. Also, take note that they are setting the velocity on the X, Y, and Z. And in all three of them, they are using the same hard-coded magic number as deviation. Deviation means that how far it will drop the item from the center because of its velocity. This is physics things, okay? So we didn't need this. We don't need to provide any double randoms. So instead of math.floor, for X, I could directly use the X. And I want to scatter in a less far distance. This is why I'm hard coding a scatter deviation that is the same magic number, but I'm dividing it by 4. So I'm reducing that deviation force on the velocity. And finally, I did copy the spawn code without any mumbo jumbo for randomness and just add that 0.2 for the upward velocity and just use that code to spawn items in the world. Now, I have an overload that doesn't accept the scatter deviation because right now we have it there and we use the default scatter deviation there. Set position, as I said, looks into the new block entity and adjusts its fields using the original block entity. We broke the word, we broke the block, we set the block, and finally we set the position of the new block entity, and that's it. So other than the original should tick methods that I had and get distance, I added these methods that we can use. When I had done it and when I went back to towering to replace every code with this process block, I noticed something. When I was using new pose down 2 on the if statement on the process block, at the time when I was trying to set the state, I was not properly using that down 2, and that was a bug. Thankfully, now that I have a neat code and very small code, I can easily handle that. And as you see, this is saying chunk goo. Well, I don't need a chunk goo. In this case, we need a towering. And be careful because the refactor tried to fix every block with the proper method calls when we added the parameter to the method. Now, you may ask, why did I added facing to spawn? Right now, this facing is not being used. Well, the reason is that my first iteration, I was using the player.get block pause, and then it would drop the items at the edge of the block and it would screw up with the gameplay feeling for the players. So I thought to myself, what if I want to use facing to adjust the proper position? And then I noticed that no matter the facing, we will always have 0.5 on the X and Z to be centered on the block. And then I noticed something else. If I have 4 hoppers sitting side by side, and don't forget, I want to activate a goo block here for a chunk outside of the current chunk at the edge of the next chunk. And let's say that this is our chunk, okay? So if my player is standing here, when I'm gonna add 0.5, it means that I will move 0.5 from this direction and 0.5 to that direction. It will be at the center of this block. However, a smart player that has enough experience using hoppers in item sorting may want to stay on the junction of these 4 hoppers. The reason is that when items are scattering around, each item has a chance of distributing itself between 4 hoppers now. If I would hard cast 0.5 to the X and Z, I would lose that option. So instead, I moved back and changed the player position from get block pause to get pause. This is the exact location of the player in the world. And then I just added 0.5 to it because if you stand in the center of a hopper, I don't know if you noticed it or not, the player will sink into the ground a little bit because of the hitbox. And the position of the player on Y is a little bit lower than the place that hopper looks for the items. So if I don't add anything to the Y, the items will drop in the same space as the hopper and the hopper will not collect them. Adding a little bit of offset helps to increase the height, and by doing that, the items will not drop below the hopper. So long story short, this facing is not being used anymore. And because of that, I can remove that facing from here and from here and of course from here. Now, I don't have the facing, so bye-bye to that, and I don't need to read the facing here for breaking the blocks. Okay, however, I will have another problem, but I will take it from here because I was thinking about tunneling and I said that, you know what, it's irrelevant right now. So we don't need this. In towering and goo bomb, you see that I'm just using the process block properly with the proper amount of going down. In the chunk goo, I have 1 process block alone, and this should be a chunk bomb goo. That's the correct one. And now that I'm comparing them, this is chunk bomb goo, chunk bomb goo. These are the same things. And here is the same thing. So I'm duplicating this let's see if we can make it simpler. I get default state of the block. Okay, I can simplify this one because if I'm sending in the block, then I don't need to check this one. Instead of that, I can say block dot get default state and get done with this, get done with that, move it back, and the state is now redundant, so remove that. And here we don't need this long state thing because as you see, we are repeating ourselves to get the state here. So now that we are directly sending in the block, we don't need to be careful about the state, and the code is much neater now. So chunk bomb goo, and finally getting rid of these states. As you see, this is code refactoring for you. You do some stuff, things work now, and then you come back and think to yourself, I want to make things much more friendly for the readers or for myself when I come back to this code, I don't know, a whole year later. And well, you know what? We had a hard-coded value there that you should get rid of that. And by doing it, now we have a proper code. However, one more thing that is left. If you were paying attention, you see that in our video, we had new pause.getY is greater than word.getBottomY, both in towering and in chunk bomb. And now it says greater or equal to word.getBottomY. The reason is that I noticed this much later in the game test of chunk goo bombs. They would go down, 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 down to the bedrock, and every now and then you would see some goo bombs sitting there surrounded by bedrocks without getting back into air. The reason is that they would not fall into this condition because the Y was equal to bottom Y. So there was nothing else to handle that. However, does that mean that we will go beyond the bottom Y? No, it's okay. And the blocks now destroy themselves at the very end limit of the word. So keep that in mind. And finally, I have the ability to sit back and work on tunneling in the next video. However, I wanted to show you that first, you can use get drop to stack on the block to actually break the items and read the items. However, remember, this will not break the block. If I go into the implementation, you see that it gets a builder, adds stuff to the builder, and that says, hey, state get drop to stack by the builder and get drop to stack on the state. It says get the block and get drop to stack as block state for the builder, okay? And it returns a list of item stacks. However, it will not call the word.break block. Means that the block is still there and it's your responsibility to break that block one way or another, maybe setting the state to air, or in our case, replace it with a new goo block. So if you are using that get dropped stack, be careful that your original block may not be broken. Just double check it and make sure that you handle the situations properly. I didn't actually check it. I'm not sure if I'm telling you the correct information or not. Sorry, I didn't have enough time for that. But you can do it, you know. Just get the dropped stacks for a block, add some coordinates, and check if the block is actually broken or not. I assume it's not. And just put a comment under the video, say that, hey, it did break the block or it didn't break the block by default so that everyone can read it and understand. If you like these videos, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and turn on that bell so that when I publish a new video, you will get informed. Have fun, everyone. Bye.